think about some of the truly mind-bending AI capabilities we've witnessed recently. ChatGPT creating compelling text and code, AlphaFold predicting intricate protein structures with unprecedented accuracy, AI systems mastering games like chess and Go at levels previously thought impossible without, exhaustive search. What's the fundamental engine, the underlying architecture powering so much of this revolutionary progress?
Well, it's a specific type of neural network, one that fundamentally changed how we handle sequences of data. And its influence has just exploded, far beyond its origins in language.
Exactly. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into the transformer architecture. We're drawing primarily from a comprehensive overview we have from Wikipedia, aiming to unpack this complex topic for you.
Right.
We want to understand its key building blocks, the ingenious way it operates, a bit of the story behind its creation, and crucially, why it has proven to be so incredibly powerful and versatile across seemingly unrelated fields.
Yeah, it's popped up everywhere.
Our mission is to equip you with the essential knowledge to really grasp the aha moments of the transformer without getting bogged down in every single mathematical detail. Okay, let's unpack this.
Sounds good. So before the transformer arrived, which was what, 2017?
Yeah, around then.
Right. Before that, the world of sequence modeling was, well, it was dominated by recurrent neural networks, RNNs. Models like LSTMs and GRUs, they were the cutting edge. They were certainly better than earlier RNNs at remembering information over longer stretches of text or other sequential data.
Right, but RNNs, by their very nature, had a fundamental bottleneck, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely.
They had to process input one token, one word, one piece of data at a time. Sequentially, you couldn't process the whole sentence in one go.
Exactly. And that sequential processing was a major limitation, particularly for training. It made it very difficult to fully parallelize the computation across powerful hardware like GPUs.
No, right, because you're always waiting.
You were always waiting for the previous step to finish. Plus, despite the improvements in LSTMs, they could still struggle with dependencies over really long sequences. It was kind of a lingering echo of the vanishing gradient problem.
Where the training signals just fade away.
Yeah, precisely. The signals needed to train the network effectively would just get weaker and weaker over distance.
So this led to the development of the encoder-decoder structure, or C2-sec models. It was a bit earlier, right? Mid-2010s.
Yeah, around 2014, 2015, the idea was to have one network, the encoder, read the input sequence and kind of condense it into a summary.
Like a thought vector.
Sort of, yeah. And then another network, the decoder, would take that summary and generate the output sequence.
Okay.
And these initially used LSTMs or GRUs,
Yeah.
but they hit a different kind of bottleneck. The encoder had to squeeze all the information from a potentially long input sequence into a single fixed-size vector.
That sounds difficult, like summarizing a whole book in one sentence.
Exactly. You inevitably lost a lot of nuance, especially for very long inputs. This is why researchers started adding attention mechanisms to these RNN-based C2-seconds models.
Ah, so attention wasn't brand new with the transformer.
Not entirely. The concept was there. It allowed the decoder to selectively look back at different parts of the input summary or even the raw input states rather than just relying on that single compressed vector.
Okay, so attention was already a concept, but it was an add-on to the sequential RNNs, helping them cope.
Right. It patched a hole, basically.
Yeah.
And then came the bombshell paper, Attention is All You Need, in 2017, from Google researchers.
Okay.
Yes. And that paper's radical hypothesis was, what if you threw out the recurrence entirely?
Get rid of the LSTMs, the GRUs.
The whole sequential part. What if you built the entire model purely out of attention mechanisms? The core insight was that attention allowed processing all tokens in a sequence simultaneously, calculating how each token related to every other token in one parallel step.
And that was a breakthrough for parallel training on GPUs, finally.
Exactly. That parallelizability fundamentally changed the game. It unlocked the ability to train models on vastly larger data sets and with many, many more parameters than was previously feasible with RNNs.
And the timing was just perfect.
It really was. It laid the groundwork for the explosion in AI capabilities we've seen since, directly leading to foundational models like BERT for understanding language.
Which is encoder-based.
Right, we'll get to that. And the generative powerhouses like the GPT series.
Decoder-based.
Yep. Even established systems like Google Translate started integrating parts of the transformer. I think they adopted a transformer encoder pretty early on.
Okay, so if recurrence is out and attention is in, how does this magic box actually work? How does it convert raw text into these powerful representations and then back out again? What are the fundamental pieces we need to understand?
Well, at a high level, you can think of it as a pipeline. Text goes in.
Raw text.
Raw text, yeah. It gets broken down and represented numerically. That's tokenization and embedding. Then it's augmented with its positional encoding.
Crucial because there's no sequence anymore.
Exactly. Then it's processed deeply through stacked layers of attention and feed-forward networks, the encoder-decoder part. And finally, it's converted back into output tokens that's unembedding.
Okay, let's start at the very beginning then. You can't just feed letters into a neural network.
Right, absolutely not. The first step is tokenization. This breaks the raw text into discrete units or tokens.
Like words or parts of words.
It could be words, but more often now it's common subword units. Algorithms like byte pair encoding or BPE are very common. They find frequent character sequences, or it could even be individual characters sometimes.
And each unique token gets an ID number.
Exactly, a numerical ID. The total set of unique tokens the model understands is its vocabulary, and its size is a pretty critical design choice.
And once you have these numerical tokens, these IDs, how do you give them a meaningful representation for the network to actually work with?
That's the job of the embedding layer. Each token ID is converted into a dense vector, essentially a list of numbers.
Not just a single number, but a whole vector.
A whole vector, yeah. You can visualize this as a big lookup table where each row is the vector for a specific token ID. Mathematically, it's like multiplying a one-hot vector by a weight matrix.
And this vector represents the token's meaning somehow.
It aims to, yes. It captures some initial semantic meanings, so words with similar meanings might end up with similar vectors, hopefully. This vector size is often called the embedding dimension or hidden size, D model in the paper's notation.
Okay, but here's the thing we touched on. If the transformer processes everything in parallel, how does it know the order of the words? If you scramble the tokens, dog bites man becomes man bites dog, which is very different.
Yep, absolutely critical point. That's where positional encoding steps in. Because you're right, unlike RNNs that inherently process positions step by step, the parallel processing of the transformer means it has no built-in sense of order.
So you have to add it back in somehow.
Exactly. Positional encoding adds a specific vector to each token's embedding vector. And this added vector uniquely identifies, or at least encodes, that token's position in the sequence.
And the original paper used a specific, slightly weird method for this, right? Something with sine and cosine?
Yes, sinusoidal functions. They used sine and cosine functions of varying frequencies. It sounds a bit complex, but the elegant idea behind it was that by using these specific functions, a fixed offset in position, like say moving from word 3 to word 5, corresponds to a simple linear transformation in the positional encoding space.
Okay. And why is that good?
Well, the hypothesis was that this structure would make it easier for the model to learn to attend based on relative positions. To learn things like the word it often refers to a noun 2 words back, regardless of whether that noun is at position 5 or position 500.
Ah, so it helps generalize relationships based on distance.
That was the idea. And while they did try learn positional encodings too, the original sinusoidal ones worked well. Interestingly, sometimes, particularly with the masking we'll talk about later, the network can even implicitly learn some positional information without explicit encodings.
Fascinating. Okay, so we have these embedded vectors, now enhanced with position information. Where do they go next?
They feed into the heart of the architecture, the stacked encoder and decoder layers.
Stacks, so multiple layers on top of each other.
Yes, typically multiple layers. The original transformer, built for tasks like translation, had stacks of both an encoder stack to process the input sequence and a decoder stack to generate the output sequence.
Okay, let's look inside an encoder layer first. What is actually happening in there?
Each encoder layer is relatively simple in structure. It's composed of 2 main sublayers, a self-attention mechanism followed by a feed-forward network.
Self-attention, what does that mean?
It means the layer allows every token in the input sequence to look at and weigh the importance of every other token in that same input sequence.
So a word attending to other words within its own sentence to figure out its context.
Exactly. It's building a rich, contextualized representation for each token, informed by its relationship to everything else in the input. Since the encoder's job is usually to understand the entire input sequence at once.
Like in BERT.
Right. There's no restriction here. Attention is computed from every token to every other token, all to all.
Okay, Makes sense for understanding the input.
Yeah.
Now, the decoder layers, you said they're a bit more intricate?
They are, yeah. They add another layer of complexity, mainly because they're designed for generation, often token by token.
Like in GPT, generating text.
Precisely. A decoder layer has three main sublayers: a masked self-attention mechanism, then a cross-attention mechanism, and finally, like the encoder, a feed-forward network.
Okay, let's break that down. Masked self-attention first. Why masked?
This is absolutely critical for preventing cheating during training and generation. When the decoder is trying to predict, say, the next token in an output sequence.
Like the next word in a translation.
Exactly. It should only have access to the tokens it has already generated, or the special start token. It shouldn't be allowed to peek ahead at the correct answer.
Okay.
So causal masking ensures that attention is restricted. A token at position T can only attend to tokens at positions 1 through T. It can't see the future tokens at positions on+1, on+2, and so on.
Got it. It forces the model to generate step-by-step, left to right, just like we would.
Auto-regressively.
Okay. And the second attention mechanism in the decoder, cross-attention.
Right? Cross-attention, sometimes called encoder-decoder attention. This is where the decoder gets to look back at the input sequence. Specifically, this layer allows the decoder to attend to the outprint of the final encoder layer, that contextualized representation of the original input sequence we talked about.
So that's how the translation happens. The French decoder looks back at the English encoder's output.
Precisely. It figures out which source words are relevant for generating the next target word. And there's no masking needed here because the entire input sequence has already been processed by the encoder. Its representation is fully available.
Makes sense. Encoder output feeds into the decoder's cross-attention. And after these attention steps in both encoder and decoder, there's that feed-forward network layer again.
Correct. Same idea as in the encoder. It's a standard neural network layer, typically 2 linear transformations with an activation function in between, like ReLU or DLU or SWIGLU these days.
And it's applied independently to each token's vector.
Yes. Independently to each token's vector representation after it's gone through the attention step. It just provides some additional computation and nonlinearity.
And you mentioned the internal dimension is usually bigger.
Often, yeah. Typically maybe 4 times wider than the embedding size. That pattern holds in models like BERT and GPT-2 as well. More capacity for processing there.
Now, let's get back to the core idea you mentioned, attention. This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
How does that scaled dot product attention actually calculate this relevance between tokens? How does the math work?
Okay, at its heart, it's all about comparing things. For each token that's doing the query token, we generate 3 different vectors. By passing its current vector representation through 3 separate learned linear transformations, think of them as weight matrices. We call the resulting vectors the query vector, Q, the key vector, K, and the value vector, V.
Okay, query, key, value, Q, K, V. Give me that analogy again for what they represent.
Sure. Think about searching a library catalog. Your query Q is like your search term. What am I looking for? Each book on the shelf, every other token, has a key K, like its title or keywords. What am I about? You compare your query to all the keys to find the best matches.
Okay.
The value V is the actual content of the book or the information it offers. Here's what I actually contain. So the attention mechanism calculates how well your query matches each key.
The relevance score.
Exactly. And then it gives you back a weighted sum of the corresponding values where the weights are based on those relevant scores. The best matches contribute more of their value to the final output.
Okay, I think I get the concept. And mathematically, how does that query key comparison work in the transformer?
It's surprisingly simple, actually. For a given query token, you compute the dot product of its query vector Q with the key vector K of every other token in the relevant sequence.
Just multiplying the vectors together?
Element-wise multiplication and sum, yeah. The dot product. It's a measure of similarity or alignment between the 2 vectors. High dot product means high similarity. These similarity scores are then scaled down. They're divided by the square root of the dimension of the key vectors, often denoted d key.
Ah, right, the scaled part of scaled dot product attention. Why the scaling again?
It's a crucial detail for stable training, especially when the vector dimensions get large. Without scaling, the dot products can become very large in magnitude.
And that messes things up.
It pushes the subsequent softmax function towards extreme values probabilities very close to 0 or 1. This results in very small gradients during backpropagation, which makes learning really slow or unstable. Scaling helps keep the attention scores in a more manageable range. Better gradients, easier training.
Got it. So scale the scores,
Yeah.
then what?
Then you pass these scaled scores through a softmax function.
Softmax. That turns scores into probabilities, right?
Exactly. It normalizes the scores across all the tokens being attended to, so they sum up to 1. You get a nice probability distribution representing how much attention or relevance the query token should pay to each of the other tokens.
Okay, so now we have weights for each token.
Right. And finally, you compute a weighted sum of the value vectors, V, for all those tokens using these softmax weights. The result is the final output vector for the original query token. It's now enriched by information from other tokens, blended together based on their calculated relevance.
Wow.
And the beauty is, this happens for all query tokens simultaneously using highly optimized matrix multiplications on GPUs, working with the Q, K, and V matrices stacked together.
So for each output token, you're essentially getting a customized blend of information from the input or preceding output sequence, weighted by relevance.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, because the query and key transformations are different learned matrices, this relationship isn't necessarily symmetrical. Token A might pay a lot of attention to token B, but token B might not pay much attention back to token A.
Right. And on top of this basic mechanism, we have multi-headed attention.
Yeah.
Why complicate things with multiple heads?
Well, the idea behind multi-headed attention is to allow the model to focus on different things simultaneously. It takes this core attention determinism.
The QKV calculation.
Right, and it runs it in parallel multiple
Yeah.
times, say 8 or 12 or even more times, but using different independently learned linear transformations for Q, K, and V in each head.
So each head gets its own set of QKV matrices.
Exactly. It's like looking at the same sequence through several different specialized lenses or filters at the same time.
Why would you want to do that?
Because each head can potentially learn to focus on different kinds of relationships or different aspects of relevance. One head might become really good at tracking, say, syntactic dependencies, subject-verb agreement.
Yeah.
Another head might focus on semantic similarity, or maybe track pronoun references. A third might just focus on the immediately preceding or succeeding word. Having multiple heads allows the model to capture a richer, more diverse set of these relationships simultaneously than a single attention mechanism could. It gives it more representational power.
That makes sense, like having specialists working together. And the outputs from these different heads, how are they combined?
It's quite straightforward. The output vectors from each head are simply concatenated together side by side, creating one larger vector.
So if you have 8 heads, the vector becomes 8 times bigger temporarily.
Exactly. And then this larger concatenated vector is projected back down to the model's expected hidden dimension using one final learned linear layer. This mixes the information learned by all the heads together.
Okay, we've covered the main computational blocks, embedding, positional encoding, the different kinds of attention, feed-forward networks. But you mentioned assembling these into deep stacks requires some architectural glue to make training actually work reliably, right? Deep networks can be tricky.
Absolutely. Training really deep networks is notoriously hard. Two critical components that make deep transformers trainable are residual connections and layer normalization.
Residual connections.
Well,
Like skip connections.
exactly like skip connections. These are vital for numerical stability and ensuring that gradients can flow effectively through many layers during backpropagation. A residual connection simply adds the input of a sublayer directly to its output.
So the output isn't just the result of the sublayer, but the result plus the original input.
Precisely. The calculation becomes output, input, plus sublayer, input. This creates these direct pathways for gradient flow, almost like shortcuts, which combats the problem of gradients shrinking or exploding in very deep networks. It just makes it much easier to train these models effectively.
Okay, residuals help gradients flow. And layer normalization. What does that do?
Layer normalization adjusts the activations within each layer to have, typically, 0 mean and unit variance, unlike batch normalization, which is common in computer vision and normalizes across a batch of examples.
Right.
Layer norm normalizes the vector for each individual token independently across its feature dimension. So within a single sequence items vector.
Why is that better here?
It works better for variable sequence lengths, common in NLP, and it helps stabilize the distribution of activations across layers and tokens, further aiding training convergence and making the training less sensitive to initialization.
Okay. Now, I've heard people talk about post-LN versus pre-LN. What's that distinction about? Is it important?
It actually turned out to be quite important for training stability. The original 2017 paper used post-layer normalization, where the normalization step happens after the residual connection has been added, so add then norm.
Okay.
While it worked, it was sometimes tricky to train very deep models this way. People found they often needed techniques like a careful learning rate warm-up period to get things started without exploding.
Right.
Later research found that applying pre-layer normalization, where you normalize the input before feeding it into the attention or feed-forward sublayer, and then add the residual connection, norm then add, is generally more stable.
Just switching the order.
Just switching the order. But it makes training easier, allows for higher learning rates, and often lets models converge faster, especially for very deep architectures. It's become pretty standard now.
Good to know. Okay, so after the input goes through all these stacked layers, attention, feed forward, residuals, normalization, the final output from the decoder stack is a set of vectors, one for each output position. How does the transformer turn those back into actual words or tokens that we can read?
That's the final step, the role of the unembedding layer, sometimes called the output projection or language modeling head.
Unemitting. Makes sense, the opposite of the start.
Exactly. It takes the final vector representation for each position in the output sequence and transforms it into a probability distribution over the entire vocabulary.
So for each position, it gives a score for every possible word in its dictionary.
Precisely. This is typically done with one more linear layer, whose output size is the vocabulary size, followed by a softmax activation function. This assigns a likelihood score to every possible token the model could output next at that position.
And then you just pick the highest probability token.
That's the simplest way, called greedy decoding. Or you might use more complex sampling strategies like beam search or temperature sampling to get more diverse outputs, but fundamentally it comes from that probability distribution generated by the unembedding layer.
And I read something about weight tying here.
Ah, yes, that's a common optimization. Often, the weight matrix used in this final linear unembedding layer is tied to be the transpose of the initial token embedding matrix used at the input.
So the same weights, just flipped.
Essentially, yes. It saves a significant number of parameters, especially with large vocabularies, and it seems to act as a beneficial form of regularization, enforcing a kind of symmetry between mapping tokens to vectors and vectors back to tokens.
Clever. Okay, so we've detailed the original encoder-decoder structure, which is great for sequence-to-sequence tasks like translation. But you mentioned earlier, not all powerful transformers have both parts, right? We hear so much about BERT and GPT.
You're absolutely right. The architecture is wonderfully modular, which has led to several common variations tailored for different kinds of tasks.
Like encoder-only models, you mentioned BERT.
Exactly. Encoder-only models, like BERT and its many descendants, are designed primarily for understanding and producing representations of a single input sequence. They consist solely of stacked encoder layers, the self-attention, and feed-forward blocks.
And what are they used for?
Tasks like classification, sentiment analysis, question answering, where the answer is a span of the input text, named entity recognition. Basically anything where you need a deep understanding of the input, but you don't necessarily need to generate a whole new distinct sequence from scratch.
Okay. And the really famous generative models like the GPT series.
Those are the canonical examples of decoder-only models. They completely omit the encoder stack, and, crucially, they also omit the cross-attention mechanism that would attend to an encoder if it existed.
So just the masked self-attention and feed-forward parts.
Exactly. They are built purely with stacked decoder layers. Their power comes from being trained, typically, to predict the next token in a sequence, using that causal masking we discussed earlier to ensure they generate autoregressively one token at a time, based only on what came before. They're built for generation.
Makes sense. And the original encoder-decoder type, like the first transformer,
Yes.
still used.
Oh, yes. Still essential for tasks that explicitly map one sequence to another, where the output structure might be quite different from the input. Machine translation is the classic example. Abstractive summarization, where you generate a summary that isn't just copying sentences, is another. Models like T5 or BART are prominent examples of this full encoder-decoder architecture.
Okay. And you briefly mentioned prefix LMs.
Yeah, that's sort of a hybrid variant, often built on a decoder-only structure, but using a specific type of masking that allows bidirectional attention over an input prefix part of the sequence and only causal attention over the part being generated. It blurs the lines a little, but is another way to structure sequence-to-sequence tasks.
So these models are huge, often billions of parameters. How are they actually trained to do anything useful? It must take enormous amounts of data and computation.
It absolutely does. The standard paradigm that emerged, and it's been incredibly successful, is a two-stage process. Pre-train, then fine-tune.
Pre-training first, you said, on massive data sets.
Yes. This is usually the most computationally intensive step by far. Models are pre-trained using self-supervised learning on absolutely massive amounts of unlabeled data.
Unlabeled, so no human effort needed to tag it.
Right. That's the beauty of self-supervision. The data itself provides the learning signal. We're talking petabytes of text scraped from the internet, books, code repositories, articles, things like the pile data set are examples. The model learns general patterns of language, grammar, common sense facts, reasoning abilities, relationships within the data, all without needing specific human-provided labels for what the output should be for a given input.
Okay, but how does it learn without labels? What kind of self-supervised tasks does that involve? What's it actually trying to do during pre-training?
There are a few common objectives. One is masked language modeling, MLM, which was famously used in BERT. You randomly mask out, say, 15% of the tokens in the input sequence, and you train the model to predict what the original masked tokens were based on the surrounding context.
Ah, like fill in the blanks on a massive scale.
Exactly. It forces the model to learn bidirectional context. And note, this masking for MLM is different from the causal attention masking we talked about in the decoder.
Right, different concepts. Okay, what else?
Another key one, particularly for decoder-only models like GPT, is autoregressive language modeling. Here, the model is simply trained to predict the very next token in a sequence, given all the preceding tokens.
Just predict the next word over and over.
Yep. You feed it a sequence, and for each position, it tries to predict the token that actually comes next. The causal masking ensures it can only use the past to predict the future. This naturally trains it for generation.
And prefix language modeling, used in T5.
That's another variation often used for encoder-decoder models. It's sort of a mix. You give the model an input prefix, like a question or a sentence to translate, and train it to predict the entire rest of the sequence, the answer or the translation.
Okay, so that's the massive, expensive pre-training. What happens next? Fine-tuning.
Exactly. Once the model has acquired this broad, general understanding of language or whatever domain it was pre-trained on from the pre-training phase, it's then fine-tuned. This uses supervised learning, usually on much smaller, specific, labeled data sets designed for particular tasks.
Labeled this time. So humans do get involved here.
Yes, for fine-tuning, you typically need data where you have input-output pairs, like pairs of English and French sentences for translation, or questions paired with their correct answers, or documents paired with their summaries.
And this adapts the general model to a specific job.
Precisely. The pre-training gives you a highly capable generalist, a strong foundation. Fine-tuning then specializes that model to perform a distinct job very well, whether it's translation, summarization, sentiment analysis, code generation, named entity recognition, question answering, countless downstream applications.
It's amazing how effective that two-stage process has been. Now, the attention is all you need. Paper was really just the starting gun, wasn't it? The transformer architecture has been a massive area of research and development since 2017. What are some of the most significant evolutions and improvements we've seen?
Oh, absolutely. It's a constantly evolving field. Researchers are always experimenting. For instance, with different activation functions beyond the original ReLU. Functions like GEELU, Gaussian error linear unit, or SWID-GLU often lead to better performance or training stability.
And normalization. Still layer norm.
Mostly layer norm, especially pre-LN, but there's also work on alternatives like RMS norm, root mean square normalization, which is simpler and sometimes faster. Small tweaks can make a difference at scale.
And positional encodings seem to be a hotbed of innovation too. You mentioned sinusoidal was just the start.
Definitely. While the original sinusoidal method is solid, people realized it might not be optimal, especially for very long sequences or for capturing relative positions perfectly. So we've seen alternatives pop up.
Like what?
Rotary positional embedding, or ROPE, is a very popular one now. It cleverly embeds relative position information directly into the attention calculation by rotating parts of the query and key vectors based on their position. It's proven quite effective.
Interesting. Rotating vectors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another one is alibi, which stands for attention with linear biases. It's surprisingly simple. It doesn't use explicit positional embeddings at all. Instead, it just adds a simple learned bias directly to the attention scores based on the distance between the query and key tokens.
Just a penalty for being far apart.
Sort of, yeah, a learned penalty or bias. And remarkably, this helps models extrapolate to sequence lengths much longer than they were ever trained on. It's quite neat. Relative position encodings are another family of methods using similar bias concepts, sometimes implemented efficiently with special matrix structures like Toeplitz matrices. It's a really active area. Some even argue that with causal masking alone, models can sometimes learn relative position implicitly.
Wow, okay. Now, as models get larger and the sequences they process get longer, think summarizing entire books or processing long videos, efficiency becomes a monumental challenge, right? Training and just running these things must consume vast computational resources.
Absolutely monumental. Making transformers more efficient, both for training, but especially during inference when you're actually using the deployed model, is a huge research
Yeah,
focus.
what are some key efficiency improvements there?
For autoregressive generation, like in chatbots where you generate token by token, KV caching is absolutely fundamental.
KV caching, what's that?
Remember how for each new token the decoder generates, it needs to attend back to all the previous tokens it generated? To do that attention calculation, it needs the key, k, and value v vectors for all those previous tokens.
Right.
Instead of recomputing these k and v vectors from scratch every single time you generate a new token, which would be incredibly slow as the sequence gets longer, KV caching simply saves them in memory. So you only compute the K and V for the new token and reuse the cached ones for all the past tokens.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Huge speed up, I imagine.
Massive speed up for inference. It changes the complexity per step from depending on the sequence length squared to just depending linearly on the sequence length. Page attention is a more recent memory management technique specifically designed to make this KV caching even more efficient on GPUs, handling the memory fragmentation better. Very important for serving large models.
Okay, KV caching speeds up generation. What about speeding up the attention computation itself?
Yeah.
That n-squared relationship with sequence lengths you mentioned earlier sounds like a killer for really long inputs.
It absolutely is. That quadratic dependency where the computation grows with the square of the sequence length is the Achilles heel for applying transformers to very long sequences like high-res images, long documents, or video.
So what's being done about that?
Flash attention was a really significant algorithmic innovation here. It doesn't change the result of the attention calculation, but it cleverly reorders the computations and uses techniques like tiling to minimize the slow movement of data between different levels of GPU memory, like the main HBM and the faster on-chip SRAM.
So it's an implementation trick.
A very clever implementation trick, yeah. It makes the computation much faster and more memory efficient on modern hardware without approximating anything. Flash Attention 2 improved on this further with better parallelism and work partitioning. It's become standard in many high-performance implementations.
Okay. And I also heard about variations on the multi-headed attention itself to save computation or memory. Something about sharing keys and values.
Yes, exactly. That tackles the memory footprint of the KV cache we just discussed, which can become enormous with many heads and long sequences. The standard approach is multi-head attention, MHA, where each head has its own Q, K, and V projection matrices.
Right.
Multi-query attention, MQA, is a simplification where all attention heads share a single key and value projection matrix while still having their own query projections.
So fewer K and V vectors to store in the cache.
Dramatically fewer. It significantly reduces the size of the KV cache needed during inference, which means you can fit longer sequences in memory or use larger batch sizes, leading to major speedups. Grouped query attention, GQA, is a compromise between MHA and MQA, where heads are divided into groups, and heads within each group share their K and V projections. It often retains more model quality than MQA while still getting significant memory savings.
Clever trade-offs. Are there any other clever tricks specifically for faster generation?
Speculative decoding is a neat one that's gained traction recently.
Speculative decoding. Sounds interesting.
The idea is you use a much smaller, faster draft model, or even just a simple heuristic, to quickly generate a sequence of several candidate future tokens, like guessing the next 5 words.
Okay, quick guess.
Then, the main, large, powerful transformer takes this sequence of guess tokens and verifies them all in parallel in a single forward pass, if the large model agrees with the draft model's predictions.
Which it might for easy parts of the sequence.
Exactly. Then you've effectively generated multiple tokens in the time it would normally take the large model to generate just one. If the large model disagrees at some point, you discard the incorrect part of the guess and let the large model generate the next token normally, then try speculating again. It can significantly accelerate decoding, especially when generation is somewhat predictable.
That's really smart. using a cheap model to propose and the expensive one to verify.
Yep. And beyond these tricks, are there fundamentally different architectures trying to avoid that n-squared attention complexity altogether for very, very long sequences? That's definitely a major research goal, creating subquadratic transformers. There are many approaches. Models like Reformer use techniques based on locality-sensitive hashing, LSH, to approximate attention by only comparing similar keys.
So approximation, not exact attention.
Right, an approximation. Sparse attention methods, like those in models like Big Bird or Longformer, try to make the attention pattern sparse, meaning each token only attends to a limited subset of other tokens, maybe some local ones and some global ones, reducing the complexity closer to n log n or even linear n, depending on the pattern.
Trying to get the best of both worlds, local and global context, without the full n-squared cost.
Exactly. There are also things like attention-free transformers that try to replace attention with other mixing mechanisms, or methods using random feature attention that approximate the attention calculation using kernel methods, potentially achieving linear time complexity. It's a very rich area, trying to scale these powerful models even further.
It's truly astonishing how much innovation has built upon that original 2017 paper. It feels like a whole ecosystem has grown around it. And while it clearly started in language, you mentioned its reach has gone far, far beyond just text. What are some of the most surprising or impactful applications you've seen?
Well, the impact on NLP is obvious, right? It's completely fueled the large language model revolution, everything from better translation, summarization, chatbots that can hold conversations, code generation, you name it.
Sure, the language stuff is everywhere.
But the really fascinating story, I think, is how it's become this general-purpose sequence processor that works across different modalities.
Like images. How does a transformer process an image?
So vision transformers, VITs, basically treat an image as a sequence of patches. They chop the image up into small, regular squares, linearly project each patch into a vector, like a token embedding, add positional encoding, and then feed the sequence of patch vectors into a standard transformer encoder.
No convolution, just patches as tokens.
Largely, yes. And it works remarkably well for tasks like image classification, object detection, segmentation, sometimes outperforming traditional convolutional neural networks, especially with large data sets.
Wow, okay, what about audio? Speech recognition.
Similar ideas there. Models like Conformer, which mixes transformer blocks with convolution, or OpenAI's Whisper often process audio by first converting it into a spectrogram, which is like a visual representation of the frequencies over time.
Okay, so turning sound into an image, basically.
Sort of, yeah. And then that spectrogram can be treated much like an image, perhaps chopped into patches or frames, and fed into a transformer architecture to transcribe the speech or understand the audio content.
Okay, vision, audio. What else? You mentioned even abstract tasks like games or biology.
Yes. It's pretty wild. Decision transformers have been used in reinforcement learning and robotics. They frame the problem as sequence modeling predicting future actions based on past states, actions, and rewards, all treated as tokens in a sequence fed into a transformer.
Huh. Learning policies by predicting sequences.
Kind of, yeah. And maybe even more surprisingly, transformers have achieved grandmaster-level performance in evaluating chessboard positions. They represent the board state as a sequence of tokens, like piece type and location, and feed it to a transformer. It learns to evaluate the strength of the position purely from that sequence without needing traditional explicit game tree search algorithms during evaluation.
Just pattern recognition on the board state sequence.
Essentially, yes, learning incredibly complex patterns. And in biology, the applications are exploding. Analyzing biological sequences like DNA, RNA, or amino acids, and perhaps most famously, DeepMind's AlphaFold 2.
Predicting protein structures.
Exactly. It used a transformer-like architecture with attention mechanisms processing information about the amino acid sequence and relationships between residues to predict the 3D structure of proteins with unprecedented accuracy. A truly massive scientific breakthrough enabled by these architectural ideas.
It seems like almost anything that can be represented as a sequence or a set of related elements is fair game for a transformer architecture to find patterns in.
That really seems to be the power of it. It's this incredibly flexible way of learning relationships between elements in a set or sequence. And it extends naturally to multimodal models, which combine different types of data.
Like text and images together.
Precisely. Models like DALL-E for generating images from text, or Muse, or Phenaki for video generation, or Elevate for understanding images and text together. They often work by tokenizing not just text, but also image features, maybe from a VIT or a CNN, video frames or audio signals signals, flattening them somehow into a common token space.
A shared language for different senses.
Kind of a common representation space that a large transformer can then process together, learning cross-modal relationships and allowing generation or understanding that spans these different modalities.
Wow. So, reflecting on all this, from that initial, maybe deceptively simple idea back in 2017, just use attention, get rid of recurrence, enable parallel processing,
Yeah.
the transformer has absolutely exploded. It
Yeah.
hasn't just revolutionized how we handle language, but it's become this fundamental, adaptable building block that's accelerating progress across computer vision, audio processing, biology, robotics, game playing, and it really feels like a cornerstone of modern AI.
It is truly remarkable how a core mechanism designed for understanding relationships within a sequence of words turned out to be so incredibly universally applicable.
Yeah.
And it really does make you pause and think, doesn't it? Given the transformer's proven ability to ingest and process such incredibly diverse forms of data, text, code, images, sound waves, biological sequences, abstract game states, and find meaningful underlying patterns and relationships within them, relationships strong enough to generate novel, coherent outputs or make complex predictions. What does that tell us?
What does it tell us?
Well, what might it suggest about the possibility that these seemingly disparate types of data language, vision, sound, biology might actually share deeper, perhaps mathematical or structural similarities that the transformer architecture is uniquely suited to discovering and exploiting?
A kind of universal structure underneath.
Maybe. Or at least a universal way to process structured information effectively. And if that's the case, what might that imply for the potential of building even more generally capable, perhaps even truly general AI systems based on similar principles in the future? This is definitely something to mull over.